Chapter 1. Rhys tried to rein in his temper as he strode up the front walk to Claire's house. He was in another alpha's territory, a much older alpha, and probably more powerful. It wasn't as if they'd ever come to blows, but with how Rhys felt at the moment that might happen today. He slammed his knuckles against the front door, pounding on it harder than necessary. Unlike the more modern housing he and his pack lived in, Kane's pack lived in a historic neighborhood in Oak Falls. It was only 2 towns over from Rhys's. The Claire pack owned land outside of Oak Falls where their pack ran when necessary, when they moved in a couple decades, as all shifters had to do in order to hide their slower aging from humans. He knew that Kane would hold onto his land. It would be sold to a holding company of sorts but would remain in Kane's or the pack's possession. The male was smart, powerful, and right now he was keeping Alyssa away from Rhys, which meant things were about to get violent. The door was wrenched open a few seconds later to reveal a pissed-off-looking Kane. Just as tall as Rhys, the male had jet black hair he kept cropped close to his head. Wearing jeans, a t-shirt, and no shoes, everything about him was tense. His dark eyes narrowed on Rhys. "You have a death wish?" Yeah, Rhys definitely should have called the alpha first before entering his territory, but he wanted to see Alyssa and wasn't giving Kane a chance to lie to him again. He was just lucky no one else in the Claire pack had seen him first. Well, maybe not lucky, because if someone had challenged him, he had no problem taking out his aggression on someone right now. He ignored the question. "Where is she?" Kane's jaw tightened, and for a long moment Rhys thought he might actually attack. Then the other alpha surprised him and stepped back slightly. "We're not having this conversation out here." Rhys followed Kane inside. The subtle sweet honeysuckle scent of Alyssa filled the house, but he could tell she wasn't there. He knew she had her own place anyway, but he wasn't sure of her address. The disappointment that punched through him was stark and consuming. Nearly a week ago she'd called him and told him she didn't want to mate him, and that was that. She'd been so formal about it, and nothing he'd tried to say had been able to convince her to give them a chance. To be fair, she'd pretty much hung up on him after saying she was done with him. Her words played in his mind, making his wolf edgy. "Thank you for being gracious enough to host my father and me in your territory, but after meeting in person I've realized we won't suit each other. I'm sure this is a relief to you as well. I hope you find the right mate." She'd said some other perfectly polite garbage in a neutral tone, but he'd tuned it all out. After the words, "we won't suit each other," had filtered through his brain, he'd nearly lost it. "Where is she?" He managed to get the words out through gritted teeth. "I don't know." Kane's entire body was stiff as he said the words. "What?" "I don't know where she is. She left a week ago." It took a long moment for Rhys to digest what Kane had said, to read the actual fear on the other alpha's face. As far as Rhys knew, Kane had always kept a close eye on his only daughter. She was basically considered a princess to the pack. Immediate worry for her sliced through him. His wolf clawed furiously, not liking this news one bit. Before he could respond, Kane jerked his chin to the left. "Come on, I need a drink." A dozen questions were on the tip of his tongue, but he held himself in check. He'd get his answers. More than anything, he wanted to see Alyssa. The 3 weeks he'd spent with her had been the best of his life. She was like a ray of sunshine, and he refused to live without her. Not when he knew that she wanted him to. Of that he had no doubt. Hell, he was the one who'd had to put the brakes on when they'd been kissing. Because if he hadn't, he'd have taken and claimed her right on his living room floor. She deserved a longer courting than that. She deserved better than him. But he was too selfish to walk away from her. His wolf had decided that she was his before they'd ever spoken 2 words to each other, and once he'd met her he agreed to. He had no clue what had gone wrong between them. Her last night in his territory, she'd been withdrawn from him, but then she'd given him a gift. A vintage baseball hat for his favorite team. It had been so damn thoughtful, so like her. Something had been off with her though, and he should have pushed to find out what it was. Feeling as if he was on autopilot, he followed Kane into a huge kitchen, bright from all the sunlight spilling into it. "Sit," Kane ordered. Rhys wanted to pace, but did as the other alpha said. He watched as the male pulled out an expensive bottle of single malt whiskey from a cabinet. Kane poured 2 glasses before joining Rhys at the center island. He slid it to Reese, and to his surprise, he saw the slightest tremble in Kane's hands. Shit. Kane was that worried this was bad. Ignoring the drink, he slid off the chair. Screw feigning civility. Kane. She's okay. That much I know. The words took away some of his fear, but not much. How do you know? She's texted me multiple times over the last week just to check in and assure me she's okay, but she disabled the locator on her phone, so I can't even track her. The last part came out as a surly grumble. Alyssa wouldn't leave you like that. Reese had gotten to know her during their time together, so he knew without a doubt that she'd never hurt her father. Kane scrubbed a hand over his face. We argued. Badly. She wanted out of the mating to you, and I told her she was being immature, that this was the right thing. I've never seen her get so mad before. She shouted at me something she's never done. I yelled back, and fuck, I made her cry. He collapsed on one of the chairs. She was gone the next morning. She was the one who wanted out of the mating? The alpha's mouth pulled into a thin line. Yeah. The knowledge was like a silver dagger to Reese's gut. He sat again and picked up the tumbler. He downed it in one swallow, savoring the burn of the liquid. I didn't hurt her, he said, maybe more to convince himself than Kane. He'd been so careful with her. Hell, they'd literally only kissed a few times. Had been intense, and he'd wanted way more, but he'd never truly touched her. He hadn't trusted himself to stop, and it had been clear she wouldn't have. Kane snorted. I know that. It's the only reason you're alive. Something was wrong. She wouldn't tell me what. Just that she didn't want to mate. Reese started to respond when he heard the sound of the front door opening. He scented a wolf, probably female, a few seconds before a tall, striking blonde strode into the kitchen. She looked between the two of them, her eyes going cold as they landed on Reese. He'd never met her before, so the coldness surprised him. Not that he cared about some random female. Is everything okay? She asked Kane, her expression softer as she looked at the alpha. He nodded. Yeah, just worried about Alyssa. God, Kane, she's fine. She just needed some space. The blonde shook her head, dismissing Kane's words so quickly it was clear she knew where Alyssa was, or at least had a good idea. The other alpha picked up on that fact as soon as Reese did. Reese wanted to grill the female, but this wasn't his territory, and he wasn't sure of the relationship between Kane and her. Kane's gaze narrowed, all worry from earlier gone, and pure alpha back in his gaze. Where've you been the last week, Ember? The blonde shrugged and glanced at the whiskey bottle with interest. Busy. Have you forgotten your manners? Aren't you going to offer me a drink? You don't drink whiskey. I wouldn't say no to a 20-year-old single malt. Damn it, Ember. He stood now, advanced on the female, who didn't back down an inch. You know where she is? She crossed her arms over her chest, arched a defiant eyebrow. Yes. It was as if all the air was sucked out of the room with her response. And you didn't tell me? Kane's voice was low and deadly. You didn't ask. And I'm still not telling you. Something electric sparked between the two of them. Even Reese could see it. Was sexual tension. He didn't give a shit what was going on, though. He forced himself to stay in his seat when all he wanted to do was get up and shake the female to force an answer out of her. Is she safe at least? Protected. Ember looked at him then, her eyes glinting with surprise. You care. Of course I care. He'd gone too long without seeing her, without touching her or hearing her sweet laugh. And he'd thought she cared about him too. She looked back at Kane then. Even though she was tall, the alpha was taller, so she had to look up. On what planet did you think it would be a good idea to force a mating on your daughter? Kane growled, but not at her bold question. It was more of a sound of frustration. I wasn't trying to force her. I won't be around forever, and I wanted her mated with someone strong, someone who would always take care of her. When Reese came to me about courting her, the blonde's head swiveled to Reese, then back to Kane. When did this happen? Reese wanted to know who the hell this female was that she was able to ask so many questions of the alpha without reprimand. But if it got him the answers he wanted, he'd tell her anything she wanted. About a month before Alyssa and Kane came to my territory, he said before Kane could respond. Frowning, the female stepped back, then moved around Kane and grabbed the bottle. Wait, there's no way you met her before then. She'd have told me. Reese rubbed the back of his neck, suddenly uncomfortable. He'd seen Alyssa out shopping in a neighboring town before he knew who she was. His wolf had woken up and taken interest immediately. He'd been about to approach her until he spotted what looked like 2 bodyguards hovering nearby. After some research, he'd discovered exactly who she was. So he'd approached Kane about courting her. Rhys had never thought the older alpha would decree some sort of arranged mating. Not that he'd argued, because he'd wanted Alyssa with every fiber of his wolf. I didn't say we met. I just saw her. Then he came to me about courting her. I was the one who decided to implement the arranged mating. Kane took the tumbler Ember had just poured and downed the contents. You're an idiot, she muttered, but with no heat as she turned to Rhys. She looked at him hard, her gaze assessing. Do you want Alyssa to strengthen your pack or for her? Her. God, he didn't give a shit about strengthening his pack. They already had a solid foothold in their territory, and that wasn't changing. He told a few annoying packmates that was why he was mating with her, but soon everyone would see she was his. She'd just give him a chance. You actually sound like you're telling the truth. I need a few days to think about it before I tell you, though. His wolf instinct had him stepping forward before he'd realized he'd even moved. Kane moved lightning fast, yanking Ember behind him as she yelped in surprise. Kane's wolf flared in his eyes, and that was when Rhys realized this was more than just sexual tension between him and the female. The alpha hadn't claimed her yet, otherwise Rhys would have been able to send him on her, but he definitely wanted to. She told you a few days, Kane growled, the sound more animal than human. Fine. You know how to reach me, Rhys said through gritted teeth. Not that he didn't already have 2 of his packmates trying to track her through other means. Sneaky? Yep. He'd hunt his little mate down any way he could. Then he'd convince her they were meant to be together. Without another word, he stalked from the kitchen and exited the house. As soon as he made it to his truck, he was calling his guys again, checking on their progress. He wasn't going to wait for one of Alyssa's packmates to tell him where she was. What was that? Ember asked, her voice breathy and far too seductive for Kane's sanity. He took a deep breath, forced his wolf under control before he turned around to face her. It was becoming harder and harder to control his wolf around her. After his mate died almost 3 decades ago, he'd never thought he'd have the desire to mate again. And not to someone so young. She was 30, but compared to his 200 it felt wrong. At least that was what he'd been telling himself the last 12 months. The excuse was getting old, though. You don't get to ask the questions, he murmured, finally turning to look at her. You've been sitting on Alyssa's whereabouts for the past week when you knew I was worried. She squirmed slightly and glanced away for a second. It's not like I've seen you the past week, so how would I know you've been worried? Don't be a smartass. He grabbed one of her hips in a purely dominating gesture, tugged her to him. Her gaze flew to his, her eyes wide with surprise, and there was definite lust in the air. From both of them, not just her. He was exhausted trying to hide his reaction to her. Who've you been with the past week? He could try to tell himself he had a right to know since he was her alpha, but it wasn't his business who Ember spent time with. She was a grown wolf, and as far as he knew, she hadn't taken any lovers in the pack. For that he was grateful. Meant he wouldn't have to kill one of his packmates. None of your business. Her expression was more confused than defiant. He sucked in a sharp breath, inhaling her sweetness. Leaning down, he ran his nose along the column of her neck. She went completely still before her long, elegant fingers settled on his chest, and he could feel her trembling. From lust or fear, he couldn't tell. Maybe a bit of both. Not that she could be afraid he'd ever hurt her. He'd rather cut off a limb. But he'd never touched her like this before, even if he'd wanted to. Tell me, he murmured. No, she shoved at his chest hard. The action took him by surprise more than anything. He didn't step back, but he lifted his head, looked down at her. Her breathing was erratic. I never thought you were cruel. Cruel? He blinked in surprise, unable to stand the sudden tears shimmering in her gaze. God, he'd made 2 females he cared about cry in the last week. What the hell was wrong with him? For the first time in years, panic invaded his veins. Shifters in his pack didn't generally cry, they usually just took out their aggression or whatever by shifting and going for a run, or fighting. He didn't know how to handle this. Using my attraction to you against me is unnecessary, she whispered as she wrapped her arms around herself, clearly protecting herself from him. I'll tell you where she is, I just promised her I wouldn't. I don't want to lie. That was when he realized Ember thought he'd been asking about Alyssa's whereabouts again. A brief burst of shame filled him that he hadn't even been thinking about his daughter's location, because the truth was if she was in danger, Ember would have already told him, so he knew she was safe. All he'd been thinking about was who Ember had been spending time with. I wasn't even thinking about her, he admitted, moving in on her, crowding her until he had her pinned against the center island. Her tears dried as she stared at him with a hint of confusion and lust. What? I just wanted to know if there was some pup I should challenge. Even the thought of her with another male made him insane. She just returned to the pack a year ago and he'd been fighting his feelings and attraction the entire time. She was strong, smart, and funny. He adored everything about her. Wait, what? Is this you being jealous? He watched her for a long, hard moment. The confusion rolling off her was real. For the last year she'd pushed his buttons and he'd let her. Hell, she was the only one in the pack he let get away with talking to him the way she did. And others had certainly noticed. Probably why none of the males had made a move on her. He might not have actually claimed her, but in one sense he had. Now it was time to man up. Yes. When her eyes widened, he continued. I want you, Ember. Have since you moved back. I won't settle for something casual, so understand this. I'm possessive, stubborn, set in my ways, and have a lot of years on you. And I've got a lot of responsibility I deal with every day, something you know. You need to think about what you want, decide if a future with me is something you can handle. Because if we cross the line, it'll be for life. He wasn't admitting that he loved her just yet because damn it, he couldn't say the words. He couldn't face her rejection. Before she could respond, he spun on his heel and stalked from the room and his house. He needed to shift and run, because being around her and not claiming her was making his wolf go nuts. Chapter 2. Shelving the guilt that had been a constant companion the past week, Alyssa dropped her duffel bag next to her and knocked on her friend Charlie's front door. Seconds later it flew open and she found herself pulled into a tight, welcoming hug. I can't believe you're here. Alyssa laughed lightly, relief invading her veins in a slow, smooth crawl. After a week of traveling, she was glad to be in Kincaid territory, a place she felt safe and welcome. Stepping back, she eyed her friend's long dark hair. You grew it out. She fingered the strands, grinned. Yeah, needed something different. Come on. Let's get you inside. Charlie grabbed Alyssa's bag before she could stop her. Friend, I've got a suitcase in my car too. Not that she needed anything from it. Right now, after a day of driving, she just wanted to kick her feet up and catch up with her old friend. She snorted. I figured you didn't pack this light. So you want to tell me why you're here? I just needed a break from my pack, that's all, Alyssa said, trailing after her down a hallway lined with beach-themed black and white prints and a few pictures of Charlie with her various packmates. The hallway opened up into a huge open living room with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Gulf Coast. Charlie was part of the Kincaid pack who lived in Orange Beach, Alabama. Alyssa knew the pack did well for themselves, and owning beachfront property was pricey anywhere. But the Kincaid pack owned the entire condominium she was now in. The way the place was built, each packmate had an ocean view. Unlike a lot of condos she'd been in, she noticed that when she'd headed up the stairs to Charlie's place, all the hallways were glassed in instead of open, and they only had one main gated entrance with a high wall blocking the parking lot. The extra privacy made sense for a shifter pack. No way. You don't get off with that easy answer. Charlie dropped Alyssa's bag next to one of the microfiber couches and continued on to one of the sliding glass doors. The calming sound of ocean waves filled the room as she opened it. When Alyssa stepped out onto the patio, she saw that Charlie had a plate of cheese, crackers, and stuffed mushrooms filled with some sort of cheesy mix. That smelled delicious. And there was a bottle of wine. I could kiss you right now. I've got vodka too in case you needed it, Charlie said on a laugh. Alyssa collapsed on one of the seats at the mosaic table. I think wine's good. She'd been on the road for a week, stopping at various places and basically just enjoying the privacy away from her pack. She checked in with her dad via text and had been calling some of her packmates so they knew she was okay. She didn't want anyone to worry, but after the blowout with her father, she'd known space and time away were the only way she'd get past everything. Charlie opened the wine bottle, poured them both glasses before sitting to talk. My dad and I got in a pretty big argument. Even the thought of it made her throat tighten. She knew she was probably being a baby, but he'd never yelled at her before. Not once. And it had come as a shock. Her reaction annoyed her. And she'd realized that if he was going to see her as an adult, she was going to have to make her own damn decisions. She never should have even entertained the idea of an arranged mating. She should have said no before they went to O'Shea territory. But she'd wanted to make her father happy. She cleared her throat when Charlie didn't respond. He wanted me to get mated to an alpha and I disagreed. Sort of. It's complicated. Anyway, when I told him I was backing out of the mating, he wasn't happy. Charlie's dark eyes widened. Wait, your dad tried to force you to get mated? Not exactly. He set up this arranged mating. What? Ignoring her friend's cry of outrage, she snagged one of the stuffed mushrooms and popped it into her mouth. When she'd swallowed, she looked at Charlie again, who was staring expectantly. So he set up this arranged mating that I wasn't planning to go through with until I met my intended mate. She felt so pathetic even admitting it out loud, but if she couldn't be honest with her friends, then she needed new ones. I thought maybe we might have a chance at happiness. Alyssa wasn't going to get into all the sweet things he'd done for her or the long conversations they'd had late into pretty much every evening for 3 weeks because it didn't matter. He felt differently about her. But it turned out I was just a business deal to him, so I told my dad I didn't want to mate with him. We fought, and I left the next morning. First, I'm surprised your dad of all people would have pushed an arranged mating, given his relationship with your mom. Alyssa nodded. She still couldn't wrap her mind around her dad's reaction. Lately he'd been edgy though, snapping at packmates. He was still fair, but his temper had seemed shorter the last few months. She wasn't sure what was going on with him. Well, she had an idea but wasn't positive. I know. Second, whoever this dickhead is who didn't want you for you. He's not a dick. Charlie snorted. Anyone who thinks of you as a business deal is a dick in my book. And I'm your friend, so I get to be childish and mock him and his definitely small penis. Alyssa snickered into her wine. She was pretty sure Reese wasn't small anywhere, but Charlie's words made her laugh. She'd met Charlie in college and, given that they were both shifters, they bonded pretty quickly. Charlie was older and had taken Alyssa under her wing more or less. She'd been a senior when Alyssa had been a freshman, so they'd really only spent 1 year hanging out, but she'd visited Charlie in Kincaid territory since graduating and vice versa. Well, I wouldn't know about that. Good, at least you didn't sleep with him. She nodded once in approval. Makes it a lot easier to get over a guy if you haven't sampled the goods. At the faint sound of a knock, Alyssa glanced at the open sliding glass door. Are you expecting someone? Grant said he'd stop by. Oh right. Charlie's alpha was giving her passage into his territory, no strings attached. She'd met him on more than one occasion when she'd visited Charlie and was thankful he was being so generous. Not that she expected less from the male. Charlie popped up from her seat and disappeared inside with a supernatural quickness. Alyssa stood and smoothed her hands down her cashmere sweater and jeans. She felt a little grungy after the day of driving and wished she'd had time to freshen up, especially since she figured she'd be getting to meet the alpha's new mate. Alyssa would be lying if she said she wasn't curious about the human female who'd made 200-year-old Grant Kincaid fall hard. Seconds later, Grant and Alyssa strode onto the patio. Wearing jeans and a t-shirt didn't take away from the aura of authority that surrounded the dark-haired alpha. Just like Reese and her father, he seemed to carry an innate sense of power like a custom-made jacket. It wrapped around the male, letting any supernatural being know he wasn't a male to mess with. Well, unless you wanted your ass kicked. Right now he was all smiles. Hey Alyssa, glad to have you back in my territory. He gave her a quick hug and a kiss on the forehead. Shifters were all about touch, but not all alphas were as friendly as Grant. Yeah, she definitely made the right decision coming here. She had downtime to breathe without being hassled by her pack. Thanks for having me. Listen, my dad doesn't know I'm here and he does now. Don't worry about it, he's glad you're here. Well, he's glad you're safe. You told him? No. I got a call about 10 minutes ago from him wanting to confirm you were here. Oh. She bit her bottom lip. Did he sound mad? Grant snorted and shrugged. He was a little surly, but you're his kid. He's fine now that he knows where you are. I won't cause you any grief by being here? That had been her main concern. If it would cause any strife between the two packs, she would just leave. No. Just relax and enjoy yourself while you're here. I think your father felt bad about something. There was a question in his gaze, though he didn't outright ask. No way was she delving into any of that. Okay then. She would enjoy herself. Thank you again for letting me stay. When do I get to meet your mate? His expression softened immediately. She's working now, but I know she's got a girls' night plan tomorrow if you. We're in, Charlie interjected, slinging an arm around Alyssa's shoulders. I'm showing my girl a good time while she's here. Grant scrubbed a hand over his face. Just keep her away from Sarah. I don't want you guys getting into trouble. Charlie laughed, and though Alyssa had no idea who Sarah was, she definitely wanted to meet her now. After Grant let himself out, Alyssa turned to her friend. You still cut hair? Every now and then, she said, picking up a slice of cheese and a cracker. I need a change. Charlie's dark eyes gleamed. I know just the cut for you, especially with your cheekbones. Good. It was beyond time for something new. Chapter 6. Remember that thing you told me I'd love for a male to do to me? Alyssa asked Ember by way of greeting when her friend answered her call. Yes. Tell me you finally let a guy go down on you. She laughed, unable to stop herself. Well, it hasn't happened yet, but it's going to. Probably tonight. Earlier today, when Reese had stroked her to orgasm, she'd wondered what it would feel like to have his mouth there as well. Ember had promised her that she'd love it, but Alyssa had always wondered how she'd get over feeling self-conscious. Now she knew, because she wanted Reese's hands and mouth all over her. She trusted him completely with her body. Don't tease me, Ember muttered. I want to know when it actually happens. That's because you're a pervert. And it's why I love you. So, I'm assuming you're referring to your alpha? Did you guys make up? Alyssa wasn't going to deny that he was her alpha anymore, because she'd started to think of Reese that way as well. Yes, not that we were ever actually arguing. Not technically. And? Have you guys moved past kissing? Yes. Are you going to make me beg for details? Alyssa murmured, looking at herself in the bedroom mirror. Reese would be picking her up in the next 10 minutes, and she still wasn't decided on what she was going to wear. She'd never cared about this stuff before. No, but no details just yet. She and Ember had been friends growing up, then Ember moved away for school, and then she'd traveled for years for her job after she graduated. Only in the past year had they become close again. While she shared everything with the other woman, Alyssa wanted to keep what had happened between her and Reese private. At least the actual details. Is he being good to you? Yes. Okay, that's all that matters. He was pretty torn up looking for you. Barged right into our territory like he had a death wish. I heard you still wouldn't tell him where I was. Ember laughed. Yeah, well, that's what friends are for. When are you coming home? Everyone misses you. I'm not sure yet. She missed her pack, but she was still unsure about where things stood between her and Reese. Not that she was unsure of her feelings, but she wanted to take things slow. She had a feeling he wouldn't mind if she moved into his place when they returned to South Carolina, but she didn't know. That was too soon. She also wasn't sure if she wanted to move back to Oak Falls. Having freedom here in Orange Beach was refreshing, as if she could breathe freely for the first time in years. If she moved to Reese's territory, she was afraid she'd lose that sense of freedom. It's nice not being smothered, huh? I swear you're a mind reader. Listen, I'm in love with your father, Ember blurted, the announcement coming out of left field. Alyssa dropped the dress she'd been holding up against herself in the mirror. She'd wondered when Ember would get around to admitting it. Not that she wanted details about them, because just no thanks. I know this sounds crazy, and if you're what? I've known for a while. I'm pretty sure he's into you too. Given his mood swings lately, she figured he was just fighting the urge to mate, which was something she really didn't want to think about. Do you hate me? No. Why would you think that? Because he's your dad. For the first time ever, Ember sounded unsure of herself. So? I want him to be happy. Hell, I want you to be happy. You guys are both adults and he's been freaking surly since you moved back. Put everyone out of their misery and go for it. It was a little weird but not enough to bother Alyssa. She figured it might be harder to deal with if they were human, but she loved her packmate and her father, and if their wolf side was happy then it was meant to be. Ember pushed out a ragged sigh. I expected you to be mad or grossed out or something. Now I don't know what to say. Just promise you'll never ever give me any bedroom details. That's the one thing I ask for. Oh, and I'm not calling you Mom. Ever. Alyssa's dad had been lonely, even if he would never admit it. And Ember was not only a good person, she was strong. Definitely the kind of mate he needed. Ember let out a loud bark of laughter. Deal. So when are you seeing Reese again? He's picking me up soon and I still don't know what to wear. Red sweater, jeans and knee-high boots, Ember said without pause. The wrap-around one? She'd been thinking something more subtle. Oh yeah, it shows off your cleavage and it's easy access for him. God, you really are a perv. Yeah. And now I'm going to go sneak into Kane's house and wait for him naked in his bed. Oh my God. No, no, no. She definitely needed to unhear that. Only time I do that, I swear. Have fun tonight and be bad. Laughing Ember disconnected. Smiling to herself, Alyssa tossed her cell onto Charlie's guest bed and tugged the clothes Ember had suggested out of her suitcase. Anticipation hummed through her as she thought about the upcoming night with Reese. She knew they'd be crossing a line, and while she was nervous, she couldn't wait to experience everything. Finally, no chaperones or packmates getting in her way. I want it official. No matter what happens between me and Alyssa, our packs have a pact of solidarity from any outside threats. Reese's voice was heated and earnest. Kane rubbed a hand over the back of his neck, exhausted from the last week and a half. He hadn't talked to or seen Ember since that day in his kitchen, and he was feeling edgy, restless. Unless you do something to impede on my territory or hurt my pack, that's always been our unofficial pact anyway. I know, but I need everyone to know it. Officially. You need it. Sighing, he shut his front door behind him. Today had been the day from hell. He hadn't realized just how much Alyssa did for the pack. For him until she wasn't here anymore. Because at this point he knew. It wasn't an if she mated with Reese, he'd have to find someone else to handle all the finances and other stuff she seemed to magically take care of. He never should have taken her for granted or hell worried that she needed someone to take care of her. She took care of all of them and he'd been too blind to see it. Yes, I need it because it will make Alyssa happy. She needs to hear and know that our mating, if she'll have me, isn't about our packs. It's one thing for me to say it, but if you spread the word that we've drawn up a blood pact before Alyssa and I mate, then it proves to her that my choice is only about her. The other alpha's words took away some of Kane's tension. This was the way mate was supposed to act and the type of male his daughter deserved. Deal. But fair warning, you hurt my daughter, pact or not, I'll gut you. I'll gut myself if I ever hurt her. A smile tugged at Kane's lips as he made his way to his kitchen. He needed a cold brew and some downtime. After being surrounded by packmates since sunup, he was done. Deal then. I'll let my second-in-command know tonight that the pact is official. The blood signings will just be a formality when you return home. I'll tell my second the same. Good. When are you bringing my baby girl home anyway? Alyssa had finally called him and he'd apologized, but he still missed his daughter. The only time she'd ever been away had been at college. He hadn't liked it then and he didn't like it now. Soon. That answer would have to do, he thought, grabbing a beer from the fridge. Popped open with a hiss, cool air rolling out the top. He inhaled, savoring the crisp scent. Good enough. Keep her safe. Always. As he hung up, the slightest sound from upstairs made him pause. His house was always open to packmates, but no one should be here and definitely not upstairs. He'd been in various meetings all day, dealing with one crisis after another when all he'd wanted to do was hunt Ember down and tell her that time was up. It was time for her to make a decision. A week and a few days was more than enough time for her to figure out what she wanted with him. After setting his beer on the counter, he slipped off his shoes and hurried up the stairs, going into full predator mode. He froze outside the door when he scented Ember. Her scent was wild and reminded him of blackcurrant. But there was something that underlined it, something that was all her. When his mate died in childbirth, he'd been devastated, blindsided. He'd never thought he'd want to mate again, but Ember had knocked him on his ass. Outspoken, smart and beautiful. He remembered the first time she told him to pull the stick out of his ass when he'd overreacted to something a packmate had done. He'd never reprimanded her because she'd been right, and he just hadn't wanted to cause her any embarrassment in front of other packmates. His wolf had known she wasn't challenging him for dominance and had been very, very interested in getting to know her on the most basic level, so even his animal side had been in agreement in letting the comment slide. She'd seemed just as surprised as everyone when he'd laughed off her smart ass remark. That was when he'd realized she'd been pushing him intentionally. From that point on, their relationship had been defined by her pushing and him letting her. Until now, he was taking everything and not letting go. If you don't get your ass in here, I'm starting without you, her voice called through the door, immediately loosening the tension in his chest he hadn't realized he'd been holding on to. When he opened the door and found her splayed out on his bed, completely naked, all coherent thought fled his mind. He was about to claim his. Chapter 7. Is this one of Grant's places? Alyssa asked as a hostess led them to a seat by the window overlooking the Gulf. Rhys snorted. No. I wanted tonight to be just about us without extra ears. She laughed under her breath as he held out the chair for her. Yeah, that's probably a good idea. Shifters and other supernatural beings had extra sensitive hearing and sight among other abilities, so eating at a shifter-run restaurant increased the chances of being overheard. When he sat across from her and pinned her with that dark stare, she resisted the urge to squirm. Everything about him was captivating, right down to the way he kept his hair cropped so close to his head. It just made him look even edgier. She wondered what he'd look like as a wolf. Hair color didn't always dictate what color your fur would be, though it did in her case. What are you thinking? He murmured, not bothering to glance at the menu yet. Just wondering what you look like in wolf form. She didn't have to glance around to know that no one could hear them. By an expansive window, the place was mostly empty and there wasn't anyone behind them on either side. She guessed it was because it was midweek and not tourist season. He looked surprised by her statement. You'll just have to go running with me to find out. Before she could respond, a server arrived and took their drink order. I'd like to go running with you, she said when they were alone again. Running with a non-pack wolf was a big deal. It implied a certain amount of trust. Me too. His gaze went molten now, and she didn't have to ask him what he was thinking. She cleared her throat and picked up her menu. More than anything, she wanted to skip dinner and just head back to where he was staying. She'd waited long enough to have sex and was glad Rhys would be her first, hopefully her last. A couple months ago she would have thought it was crazy to even contemplate settling down, but being around Rhys had changed everything. My wolf feels so calm around you, she said quietly, just blurting it out. To her relief, he nodded. Mine does too. For the most part. Well, yeah. She hid a smile, knowing what he meant. Her animal side didn't understand why they were waiting to get naked together, but Rhys made her feel safe. She knew at her most primal level that he'd never hurt her. Is that normal? She didn't say for mates because they hadn't used that word since he'd arrived in Orange Beach, but those two words were implied. I think so. My uncle never talked much about his mate, and I don't know that many mated shifters. Your pack's pretty young, comparatively speaking. Most of his pack mates were all under 40 and unmated, whereas the Kincaid pack and her own pack had plenty of shifters over 100, and most of them were coupled up. He nodded once. Once my uncle died, the older members dispersed. They didn't like the thought of me taking over instead of his son, though none of them were willing to challenge me over it. They wanted an older leader. Rhys lifted a shoulder, and she could tell he truly wasn't bothered by it. Why didn't your cousin become alpha? He didn't want to. I honestly don't know who would have won in a challenge. He's strong and smart, but he simply didn't want the responsibility of a pack. That was a big admission for an alpha to make. It meant his cousin was as powerful as him physically. Do you guys still talk? A small smile touched his lips. Damn near every week. He's busy trotting around the globe doing God knows what right now. What about you and your uncle? Were you guys close? He'd never said much about his relationship with the deceased alpha. As much as we could be. He was a hard male, fair but old school. My father. And he had a falling out before I was born. Rhys paused as their server returned with their drinks, wine for her and a beer for him. After the man took their order and they were alone again, she looked back at Rhys. Keep going, please. She wanted to know everything about this male. Taking her by surprise, he reached across the white linen cloth tabletop and took her hand, linking his fingers through hers. The skin-to-skin contact sent a shiver through her, especially since she knew how talented he was with those fingers. After my parents were killed, he took me in, no questions asked, and he never made me feel like he was doing me a favor or that he cared for me. Less because of my father. To him, blood and family were important and he took that seriously. Some days I don't think he knew what to do with me. I was very strong-willed. She snickered. Most alphas are. His lips curved up as he nodded. Yeah, my father wasn't an alpha though, so I think it took him by surprise. When he figured out I had the makings of one, he started teaching me to fight, to take care of myself right away. I miss him. What about you? Was it hard growing up as a pack princess? She rolled her eyes at the term. I never felt unloved. Sometimes I think my dad tried to overcompensate since it was just him raising me. Well, him and the pack, they all took care of each other. It was the shifter way. He was just very protective sometimes. That being an understatement. Good, Rhys grunted. She lifted her eyebrows. Good. He just nodded. So, if we decide to maybe... She felt weird saying the word mate. Mate. Apparently he had no such issue. His eyes went pure wolf as he watched her. She cleared her throat. Yes. If we do, are you going to send bodyguards with me if I want to go shopping? No. I'll just go with you myself. That's not what I mean. I know. And I don't know. If there's a threat to the pack, yeah, I'll probably go into crazy lockdown mode and ask you if you want. Ask me, huh? Yes. She'd noticed that while he was alpha, he didn't order her around. Even when he'd been annoyed that she'd been dancing with other males, he didn't get all macho and crazy about it like she knew some alphas could. Which brought up another question. I heard from Max that you came to the Crescent Moon Bar the other night. The night before you came to see me at Charlie's. His fingers tightened slightly against hers. I did. Why didn't you approach me then? He paused, clearly measuring his words. I didn't want to ambush you. I just found out what you'd overheard and you looked like you were having fun. Didn't want to give you another reason to hate me. Their server approached the table with 2 plates of steaming food. Interrupting their conversation. Though she hated to, she withdrew her hand from his. Immediately her entire body mourned the loss of their connection. Soon enough she planned to feel what it was like to have his skin on hers. Though, full disclosure though, he continued, I waited outside the bar and watched you head back to the condo with Charlie. If you'd left with a male, I don't know that I'd have shown any restraint. I know I wouldn't have. A single pulse of energy rolled off him then. The power he contained undeniable. She shivered at the dominant note in his voice, like that he was possessive of her, because she returned the sentiment. Shifters didn't share when it came to their mate. Chapter 9. Alyssa unwrapped the towel around her damp hair and hung it up on the rack in Rhys's bathroom. This morning they'd been in Orange Beach and now they were in South Carolina. She'd texted her dad to let him know she was back in state, but that she wouldn't be heading to Oak Falls until later in the week. She wasn't certain what the plan was for her living arrangements, but she planned to bring it up to Rhys tonight. He hadn't been very vocal about that, and she'd been too insecure to ask. She couldn't put it off much longer. After food though, she was starving and couldn't think straight on an empty stomach. Grant had let them use his private plane and Rhys had hired a company to drive their vehicles back, so their flight had been short and easy, and all they'd done was have sex in the private plane. Now she needed sustenance. As she finger-combed her hair, she heard the faint sound of raised voices coming from downstairs. Worry punched through her. She knew Rhys could take care of himself, but still, slipping on a robe Rhys had bought for her, she cinched it around her waist and hurried downstairs. The voices grew louder and she scented at least 4, maybe 5 other wolves. In addition to Rhys, her feet were silent as she moved toward the living room. In the entryway she paused to see Rhys and Benuk standing toe-to-toe near the fireplace. Sybil sat on one of the couches looking annoyed, along with 3 other male wolves she vaguely recognized. One she knew though. Andrew Reed, Reese's second-in-command. The others nodded politely but he grinned when he saw her. Congrats on the mating, he murmured, holding out his big arms for a hug. He'd only been in town the first couple days when she'd been in their territory, but it was hard not to like the huge wolf. He wore a blue plaid flannel shirt rolled up over his massive forearms, jeans, boots, and sported a full beard. The man looked like he should be carrying an axe and chopping down trees. Thanks. She stepped over to him, accepting his surprisingly gentle embrace. What's going on? She asked the room in general as she stepped back because Reese still hadn't looked in her direction. She understood why though. It was clear that Ben was challenging him and he wasn't turning away from the male. His alpha side wouldn't let him back down. Everything's okay, he murmured, his voice tempered. My brother's just being a dumbass as usual, Sybil muttered. And for the record, I'm sorry for his jackassery. I'm not being a dumbass and you deserve better than. Then what? Sybil shouted, jumping to her feet. God, you're such a dick, you. Don't even think to ask me what I want. Even if Reese wasn't mating someone else, guess what, I still wouldn't hook up with him. No offense, she said, quickly looking at Alyssa. But he's not even my type. Her voice was laced with the type of frustration that made it clear she and her brother had had this argument before, but the male just wouldn't listen to her. Alyssa understood that perfectly, gave her a small smile, and okay, she was relieved that the other female wasn't a threat. Ben wasn't listening though. With the blood pact in place, he doesn't have to mate her. Reese moved lightning fast, wrapping his hand around Ben's neck and lifting him off the ground in a fluid, deadly move. He slammed him against the stone wall outlining the fireplace. She instinctively winced at the cracking sound. No one else moved to help the male. This guy had challenged the alpha in his own home in front of others. No matter what, even if Reese wanted to let it go, his wolf side would never let him. Alphas had to be in control at all times. If not, the others in the pack would grow restless, question his strength and leadership abilities, and fighting would break out. Shifters could be savage. Let's get something straight right now, Reese growled at him. I'm alpha. Period. Alyssa's going to be my mate because I love her, not because I want to. Strengthen the packs or any other reason you can come up with in your head. You and I are childhood friends, and that's why I'm not throwing you out of my pack right now. But I've never been so tempted. Alyssa's mine. You say anything about her, hell, think anything negative about her, I'll rip your heart out and feed it to wild coyotes. Reese's voice was savage, more animal than man. Alyssa was going to go back to the I love her confession just as soon as possible, but until then, she hurried over to Reese's side and touched his forearm. Let him go. His muscles flexed underneath her fingertips, but he didn't loosen his grip. Didn't break eye contact with Ben. Understand that she's my mate, that nothing will ever change that, and if you fuck with her, I'll end your life. Not if you understand all that. Wide-eyed and gasping for breath, Ben nodded. Only then did Reese drop him. Ben collapsed onto the hearth, sucking in gulps of air as another male strode over and hauled him up unceremoniously. I'll take care of him, the male muttered, shaking his head in annoyance. Everyone else get out, Reese snarled, angrier than she'd ever seen or heard him. He wouldn't look at her as he pulled her close, wrapping his arm around. Not that she was worried he'd hurt her. Never that. She didn't look at the others as she heard them hurrying out, just slid into Reese's embrace, wrapping her own arm around his waist and rubbing a soothing hand up and down his chest. She could feel his wolf rippling beneath the surface, his animal wanting free to hunt and make Ben pay for disrespecting her. Can we go back to that I love you thing you just said? She asked, shifting so that she was in front of him, her hands on his waist now. He looked down at her, his wolf raging in his eyes, but when he met her gaze, he blinked and it was just Reese again. I shouldn't have told you like that. His voice was still raspy, but she could see he was calmer now as he pulled her close. I love you too. So much. Saying the words out loud was a little terrifying. But she loved him, so even if he just said that in the heat of the moment, she wasn't going to hold back. Not with something like this. Thank God. He made a sort of growling, relieved sound that made her laugh. I want you to live here with me. Permanently. If you need time to officially mate, that's not fine, but I'll deal with it. I know you do a lot for your pack. But they're just going to have to live without you because you're going to be part of my pack, our pack now. You belong by my side and I don't want to be alpha if you're not my mate. She blinked, digesting everything he'd said. I want to live here too and I want to mate soon. Maybe not tonight, but I. His mouth crushed over hers in a brutal fast claiming that was over way too fast. She sucked in a breath when he pulled back. Just needed to do that, he murmured. You can continue. She shook her head, trying to clear her thoughts. I don't even remember what I was saying. I think you were going to say you'd be moving in here now. For good. Her lips curved into a grin as she stepped closer against him, linking her fingers together behind his back. Oh, is that what I said? Excitement slid through her at the thought of waking up to him every morning, her earlier fears falling away. Yep. And you were also going to get naked in the next 60 seconds. I'm pretty sure that's where this conversation was headed. Laughing, her heart feeling lighter than it ever had, she hugged him closer. God, I love you. Good, because I'm not letting you go. His dark eyes had that possessive glint to them that made her toes curl. That was fine with her. Now that she'd found her mate, she wasn't letting him go either. Epilogue. 2 months later. Alyssa nearly jumped out of her skin when she heard the sound of the front door opening. She shouldn't have been surprised though, not with all the packmates that had been coming in and out all day to steal food before the big Christmas Eve party. They were shameless, which was why she, Sybil and Andrew had cooked for an army. Well, she'd mainly baked, the other two had done most of the heavy cooking. That was definitely not her area of expertise. Rhys had told her he had a last-minute errand to run before the big party tonight, and mostly everyone had cleared out to get ready, not wanting anyone to see what she'd been looking at. She shoved the pregnancy test into her apron pocket, then smiled when she scented Ember and her dad. It had been a little weirder than she'd expected seeing them together at first, but she was over it now. Stepping out of the kitchen, she met them in the hallway. You guys are early. Ember, wearing a black t-shirt that said OCD, Obsessive Christmas Disorder on the front, jeans, boots and fake reindeer ears, made Alyssa burst into laughter as she hurried toward them. We brought presents, Ember said, pulling her into a big hug before her dad did the same. And alcohol, her dad said. I've missed you, he murmured, kissing the top of her head. She didn't remind him that they lived about an hour away and she'd seen him literally a week ago, because the truth was she missed him too. It had been an adjustment moving away from her pack, but being with Rhys canceled out most of her sadness. Not to mention she'd been so busy taking over a much-needed role, party planner, for the O'Shea pack. Stepping into that position had been perfect for her, and she was glad she got to do what she loved. I've missed you too. Both of you. She looked between the two of them, not surprised to see that Ember was practically glowing. Every time Alyssa talked to her, she was giddy about being mated. You want to grab your bags from the car or get a drink? Most of the cooking is done, I've just got to get changed for the party. Rhys said he'd put us up in one of the guest houses, Ember said, her cheeks tinging red. Alyssa snickered. That's probably better. They were staying for a few days, and she so did not need to hear what the two of them did in their room. That was the only downside to supernatural hearing. We've got news, Ember blurted, fear and elation an odd mixture on her beautiful face. When Alyssa looked at her dad, she saw the same mix. Her gut twisted because she couldn't ever remember seeing her dad afraid. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong. Well, not wrong, it's just scary and awesome. We're pregnant. Then suddenly she understood the fear from her father. Her mother had died, giving birth to Alyssa, and he had to be afraid for Ember's safety. Ember was probably afraid because she was going to be a new mom. That's fantastic news. Congratulations. She pulled them into a big hug, wrapping her arms around both their waists. They were both taller than her, but they stooped to wrap their arms around her. Well, Alyssa could totally relate to that. She'd taken a dozen pregnancy tests today and they'd all come back positive. Now she just needed to tell Rhys. But she'd think about that later. Do you know when you're due, or is it too soon? She asked, stepping back. Before they could answer, Rhys stepped in the front door. He shoved a square box about the size of his hand into his jacket pocket as he nodded at Alyssa's dad and Ember. Hey guys. Glad you made it. As greetings were exchanged, her Hand automatically slid to the pregnancy test in her apron pocket. It was pretty early since she just missed her period, but the multiple tests she'd taken couldn't all be wrong. When he stepped away from them, the look in his dark eyes as he automatically reached for her was filled with love and adoration. She couldn't wait until they were alone so she could tell him the good news. "I missed you," she murmured, wrapping her arm around his waist. "Me too." He kissed the top of her head, the action so natural now. She leaned into his embrace, savoring the feel of him surrounding her. "Guess who's pregnant?" Ember asked, excitement rolling off her in waves. Reese's grip tightened, all the muscles in his body pulling taut as he looked down at Alyssa. "You told them first?" Hurt filtered through his words even though she knew he was trying to hide it. But how had he even known? "No. I know. Ember's pregnant." "How do you know I am?" "You're pregnant too?" Ember went into full-on squealing mode as Reese stared down at Alyssa. "You didn't tell them?" "No, I haven't told anyone. I was going to wait until we were alone." How the hell had he known? "I stopped by the house earlier when you were out getting more groceries and found your stash of pregnancy tests." His expression was unreadable. She hated when he went into that alpha mode. She was vaguely aware of Ember and her dad watching them, but all her focus was on Reese. "I wanted to wait until we had privacy, but I'm really happy about this." They'd talked about having kids, but more in an abstract way. They'd even used condoms when she'd gone into heat, but clearly they hadn't worked. Now she wondered if it was too soon for their relationship. His expression softened and he pulled out the box he'd hidden moments before. When he pulled off the lid, she grinned. "A baseball." His shoulders lifted in an unapologetic shrug as he pulled her into his arms. "Gotta start early with him." She snorted. "It could be a girl." "So you're happy? Having a kid with the woman I love more than anything?" "Yeah, I'm happy." His expression was intense as he looked down at her. That was a look she recognized clearly, even before they'd officially made it. Whenever she saw that wicked gleam in his eyes, she knew what was coming. "I think another congrats is in order," her father said, pulling her into another hug as Reese did the same with Ember. Then the front door opened and more packmates spilled in. "I'm going to be a father," Reese shouted, apparently making the decision on when they'd share with everyone an easy one. "Oh my God, I'm going to be a mom and a sister," she said, reality crashing over her as packmate after packmate hugged and congratulated her. She'd never felt more loved in her entire life. When she looked over at her smiling mate, she knew without a doubt that she was the luckiest wolf on the planet. And she was so glad he'd come after her when she'd made the mistake of running in the first place.